So hello and welcome to the New Gig podcast. I'm your host, Glen Hodgson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Christos Makridis. How are you doing, Christos?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So let's go back to the beginning. Where did it all start? Say a little bit about yourself and also your areas of focus in the academic field.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Arizona in the United States, and my parents run a Greek restaurant, and so kind of grew up in a small business atmosphere. And it was really in my undergraduate studies that I started thinking deeply about my calling and fell in love with the different tools that economics provides because it's so multifaceted. You go from like political philosophy to econometrics, and it's like all under one banner of a discipline. So I was really fascinated by that, and I had a wonderful British professor encourage me to consider getting a PhD, and that never before had it really occurred to me. And so that's when my mind started thinking, and ended up applying to a couple places, and did my PhDs at Stanford in economics and management science and engineering. What was really neat about MSNE is that it's a very broad department at Stanford. It used to actually be three different departments pre-2004: industrial engineering, engineering economic systems, and operations research. And so when it combined, I was like, wow, there's this like one department that has this multifaceted set of faculty and skill sets. And then I added on econ to that. And so fast forward a little bit, I really developed a love for studying labor markets, studying human capital, because at least in my mind, everything kind of comes back to human capital. There's all these different geopolitical, whatnot problems out there in the world. But if you don't have the right human capital, if there are frictions in the labor market, none of those other things can be solved. So I kind of view human capital as a gateway issue and studying what determines human flourishing and well-being for individuals. And so my research fell into three different buckets: the study of incentives and within labor economics, and the use of performance pay contracts, non-wage amenities, that sort of stuff. Then the study of technology and how that changes the way that people and firms behave. And then more explicitly, the study of well-being, determinants of human flourishing, and behavioral sorts of issues. And so over the course of my career, I went from just doing academic research to then also trying to operationalize these ideas in practice with my two startups, Living Opera, which is a Web3 multimedia company, and then Dynamic, which is an AI fintech startup where, and we can get into this more down the road, but basically we help deal with regulatory compliance issues by democratizing access to AI. So types of techniques that are traditionally outside the scope of kind of like the average person, or even frankly for any economist, because these are extremely difficult to program algorithms. I would try to make that more accessible and create a dashboard and all sorts of things. So what I love doing is really studying human capital, both in theory and then trying to bring it to practice.
I think this is fantastic as well. And what we love on this program is the opportunity to speak to intelligent, smart people who are doing things. And I think that the way in which you sort of bring together the sort of the practical and the theoretical model element of this, I think is really important. And this is why we sort of like to hear more from you. And particularly now as we see sort of the development of remote work, and the digital transformation of work as well. What's your take on this? What are you seeing, and how do you see this evolving over time, Christos?
Yeah, well, what I didn't tell you when in our email exchanges is that I'm actually writing a book that I anticipate coming out sometime over the next 3 to 6 months about remote work and just what this means for cities, and in particular how individuals can take advantage of what are traditionally arbitrage opportunities. And I'm going to start really specific, and then I'm going to kind of zoom out more to the macro side. But you think about the usual work week that an individual has, and there tends to be slack. There's slack at work, there's slack at home, and there's hours in the day where you would typically say, well, I wish I could use this a little bit better, but I don't really know how. And so I'm just going to watch Netflix. And in reality, that's probably not the most value enhancing activity. I'm not saying that people shouldn't watch TV and so on, but there might be areas of your life where you would like to earn a little bit more. You would like to use certain skills, maybe skills that went into hibernation because you just haven't had the opportunity to do it. And so what I think is really exciting, both from like a free market standpoint and just from a human flourishing side, is now there are new tools that are available for connecting demand and supply, and that the stigma associated with remote work, where used to, like 20 years ago, used to be this literature and management around telework, and teleworkers were always kind of viewed as a little bit less skilled. It was a very specific type of job. But now you think about a lot of professional services, a lot of services in general, and a lot of creative work is done
Yes.
remotely.
Yeah.
And so from a macro, so let me then land on the kind of what we maybe anticipate seeing on a macro side. It probably doesn't come as a huge surprise to say that like some convergence towards a hybrid work economy where there's like certain sets of jobs that fall more on one side of the spectrum over others, namely that some might be like 2 days a week in person, others that are maybe like 5 times a month. And so organizations need to figure out, and this is the more intelligent part of what I want to say, is that I think that organizations need to do a human capital inventory to understand what do the jobs really require? What are the tasks that individuals do? And then based on the tasks, that determines the amount of time that maybe people need to spend in the office. It's really the type of work and the people's preferences. And it's that joint distribution that identifies the optimal amount of in-person versus remote. And so it's a little bit of a give and take. Obviously, there's certain jobs that just doesn't make sense for an individual to do remotely. But then also there's other jobs where it's like there's a really talented person. And if that person really cares about remote work and can do a good job, and there's measurement strategies, there's performance strategies for rewarding those based on KPIs, then why not? Then you just try to find that balance, and that's where managers are able to add value, is by kind of liaising with the employees and figuring out how to make all things group together.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing these trends here in Europe, but also on your side of the pond as well, Christos, that the demand from talent, there is a shortage of the skilled individuals, and they're demanding more flexibility. They're demanding more opportunity and flexibility within that. So it's kind of in the best interests of employers, companies, and organizations to meet that need in terms of how they operate.
Yes. Yeah. And the only other last thing I'd add there is just that organizations, I think there's always this temptation to like follow the peers and the trend. And so
Right.
sometimes an organization will say, well, we just like saw in the news that this other company is going all remote, and so we should too. But you need to evaluate, because like one of my papers, so this is with a friend, Jason Schluchter at Georgetown, where we look at, we use data from PayScale. PayScale is a crowdsourcing company where we see information on salary, we see
Yeah.
information on remote work. And then importantly, we see information about how the employee perceives the underlying corporate culture at their organization. And so surprise, surprise, we find that people that really like their work, like their manager, like the atmosphere that's created, they actually, there's no employee engagement, job satisfaction difference between the sometimes remote and the never remote. It's only in the arrangements where you really don't like your manager, where people really want to be always remote because they're trying to get away from the manager. And so the only caveat that I put on a lot of the guidance that's kind of out there is that remote work is certainly a tool and a non-pecuniary amenity that can be an advantage for the employee. But the organization ultimately needs to think about those structural levers that they can pull. And remote work is not a substitute for having bad communication, lack of performance kind of schemes, that sort of stuff. So there are structural things that just need to be in place either way.
So having good managers, having sort of a framework there is as important as ever before. Maybe even
Oh
more
yeah,
so, given
even
the fact
more.
we're dealing with remote work there,
Yep.
Christos. And in your
Yep.
experience, companies and organizations, do they have this freelancer strategy? Do they have a open talent framework to get the best out of the new wave of changes in the labor market?
Yeah, well, two thoughts on this. One is there's certain tasks that tend to be easier to contract out. Think about cybersecurity. A lot of
Yeah.
organizations, mid-size, they are not going to hire a cybersecurity team. They might have a CIO, but they contract that out. And so then it's up to the cybersecurity team to figure out how they're going to run their organization. And a
Mm.
lot of times that sort of work, anomaly detection and pattern recognition, data science, that can be done remotely. And indeed, for both Living Opera and Dynamic, we're remote and it works fine for now. Now we might kind of get to a point where we want to have some in-person capabilities. So that's number one, is just there's certain tasks that tend to be contracted out a lot more easily. The second thing, though, that I think is a real area where managers struggle on is how do you reward and treat the freelancers and then the full-time employees in an equitable manner. And I have a paper with Matt Coratori on, and this is something that is a little bit kind of standing on the shelf. It's on SSRN, but we use data from Glassdoor, and we looked at individuals that are full-time and individuals that are freelancers, because that's something that is available in the database. And we basically found this kind of bifurcation in terms of how they perceive job satisfaction, and where the freelancers tend to perceive and like their work more was in those higher autonomy jobs, because it's in those jobs where they have more creative room, and then the manager isn't trying to fit them into a bucket. And so the opportunity there for managers is, well, if you can just kind of think for yourself and be creative, there are ways to fit in freelancers with the full-time workers and divide up work accordingly and figure out the right cadence. But it is tough because it just requires a little bit more planning and discretion and structural work on part of the organization.
And is the kind of the C-suite, what we tend to see here in Europe anyway, is that the C-suite is on board with this, and they understand that there's efficiency gains to be had, and also value gains in terms of the product that's delivered. Often a barrier and a stumbling block can be HR departments who are kind of wedded to the old way of doing things. They feel that a freelancer strategy or having too many consultants sort of dilutes their power and control over the structure, and they're the ones who tend to be a roadblock and say no. Is this something we need to get over in time?
Yeah, no, that HR is a challenge in so many different organizational structures. And I think part of the reason, I mean, so there's this political economy game that plays out obviously in the macroeconomic environment, but also within organizations. And anytime there's a change in headcount, a number of FTEs, full-time employees, then that kind of changes power dynamic. And so that's why I'm kind of the view that organizations need to engage in a human capital inventory or audit, and just figure out, like, what is our end, what makes our consumer really happy, and then you kind of go back to figure out, okay, these are the steps to deliver on that. Because if you don't have an inventory of just like what you need to deliver value to the consumer, then how on earth, it doesn't matter how many FTEs you have, because you don't know how to coordinate them. And that is what causes organizational mismatch. And indeed, on a macroeconomic environment, there's some good work by Chad Syverson and Pete Clino and some others, basically about mismatch at a macroeconomic level. And why is the United States so much more productive than some other countries? It's because there are price mechanisms, and there's markets that help bring supply and demand in the labor market, in product market together, versus you just like have really high productivity firms that are not able to maybe get the message out or get the right context, whatnot. And so I think that's where you just need to have the right information. And HR, I think a way to depoliticize this in organizations would be to say, hey, the organization needs to change because the economy is changing. And so let's do an audit and figure out what tasks we need, and then go from there. You're not committing one way or the other. You're just saying, like, let's gather a little bit more information. So hopefully that's something that can be helpful, practical guidance to organizations.
Absolutely. And I think that we have the extra level of here in Europe, particularly certain countries where the kind of dirigisme and the controlling hand of the state, but also trade unions and various actors and governmental bodies who want to have a hand in this process, which are maybe stopping the supply and demand, the natural indicators to be as obvious as they should be.
Right.
Excellent. And one thing I'm interested in the whole sort of debate here as well, Christos, is to look at the role of automation as well, because we hear a lot in the media, a lot of these narratives about automation is coming, X number of jobs will be obsolete within the next 5 to 10 years. What can you say about sort of the use of technology, the use of automation in the labor market, but also generally in the how economies work? Should we be worried?
Yeah, no, great question. It comes up a lot. Three main thoughts here. Number one is just to think about jobs as distributions of tasks. It's not as if a job gets fundamentally displaced all at once. It is a job consists of, like, you might be like checking email, there's talking to peers, there is doing market research, whatever the set of tasks is. And so automation and AI, which are two different buckets,
Yeah.
can displace or they can obsolete certain tasks, basically by putting the price of human labor to zero so that you want to use capital. You want to use, whether it's technology, like physical capital, or whether it's software capital.
Yeah.
And so once you think about it as distributions of tasks, then you are like, well, the claims that it's going to displace this many workers, how does that really work? Because is it really the case that, like, consultants or even, I mean, you just think about so many different jobs, mechanics, that they're just that all of their tasks can be done equally as well or better by a machine or by
Mm.
software? No, that's I mean, maybe like 10% of the tasks. And there's a nice paper by Eric Benyorson, Tom Mitchell, and Daniel Rock that uses that creates a measure called suitability of machine learning, and they go
Okay.
through all the different occupations out there, and they basically show, hey, yeah, it's true that a lot of occupations are exposed to automation and AI, but in reality, it's not going to displace that many. So number one is be skeptical of those very negative headlines. The
Yeah.
negative headlines always sell a little bit more to op-ed editors than the nice
Yeah.
headlines. Number two is one of my research papers with a friend named Juhan at Rutgers. We looked at broad changes in technology. And the way that we measured this was by looking at the Bureau of Economic Analysis measures of intellectual property. And so we were trying to get at trying to create as broad of a measure of technological change and IP as possible. And we created these measures at the county level. And then we
Yeah.
matched that with data from Gallup, where we saw individuals, I think around 1,000 people every day from 2008 to 2017, and they reported their measure of well-being. And so we did a bunch of statistical models where we related well-being with this measure of technology, controlling for a bunch of other factors, demographics, county considerations, et cetera. And our main result was that there was a positive effect of improvements in IP and the stock of IP and technology on
Yeah.
well-being. Now, that's not that we were not taking a specific view of automation or AI, although we did find that our measure was correlated with other measures of robotics and automation. So it says that it's capturing some of that. But so number one was that there was a positive effect. Number two was that the positive effect was actually concentrated in jobs where there's a high degree of trust between the employee and manager, and where the manager creates some level of structure. So if a manager takes their hands off the wheel and just lets things kind of go as they may, well,
Yeah.
then there can be a lot of chaos. Then employees don't know what to do with the technology, even if management decides, hey, we want to introduce this technology, and so on. And then the third point is really to think about, and this is some of the practical guidance I think to organizations, is think about how technology can be a complement to individuals in the supply chain that you
Yeah.
have for whatever product or service you're making. And again, that comes back to having a human capital inventory of, like, what is value to the consumer? What are the tasks involved? What are the tasks that individuals frankly don't like doing? Because I mean, imagine like going into a radioactive environment. You don't want to put on that hazard suit and do all the
No.
sorts of stuff, but like a robot can do that. And so
Yeah.
I just think about for nuclear power and for some of these different, more hazardous sort of jobs, that there's plenty of room for automation. That's a win-win for both sides. The employee doesn't want to do that. Sure, they take on a risk premium right now. They're taking higher payments, but maybe they would like to reduce their pay a little bit and just have a much safer, zero risk of contamination or whatever it might be. So those are some thoughts about just what's kind of going on and the effect that it has on
Mm.
individuals and firms.
Well, I like that. I mean, I think jobs that are repetitive, dirty, or dangerous, why not have machines doing them? As you say, people don't want to
Yeah.
be doing themselves. And that frees up their time to be able to do other things. And I think that we see, if we're just looking back in history, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the number of jobs that have been actually created on the back of machines doing more and more, taking different roles, which allow us to sort of focus on new roles as
Yep.
individuals. And the number of value creation roles that have been created that didn't exist in the past. I think we should be looking at the glass half full more than the glass half empty more often in
Yeah.
these debates.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's there's the jobs that get lost, but oftentimes people don't talk about what gets created, and it's hard to measure both sides. It's just that I
Mm.
think because of the media's desire to have more negative headlines than positive ones, that creates incentives for researchers or quasi researchers to then try to find results that kind of jive with what the story that or narrative that maybe certain people in the media want to tell. So yeah,
Yeah.
the one good paper on this is one by Daron Acemoglu and Pascual Restrepo, where they were looking at the set of new tasks that get created by AI and automation, and they build a
Right.
growth model where they show that if that rate is higher, then you can have really high growth, and if for some reason then the set of new tasks is not expanding, then we're in trouble. But I don't
Yeah.
think we're at a state where there's not new tasks and jobs that are being created by it. I think there's plenty of new creative potential.
Yeah. And with your business hat on now, Christos, who's doing well in terms of AI and actually incorporating this into structures, using the data and the feedback that's being created here and the elements into sort of structures and processes? Is there a certain type of company? Is it a specific sector? Is it
Yeah.
big, small companies? Where are we seeing the sort of the best in class?
Yeah, well, there's been such an emergence of startups in this space, and by construction, they're just going to get a little bit less visibility than kind of the
Yeah.
big publicly traded companies. And so, one example of a company that's now fairly big is called Scale AI, and I've been tracking a little bit about what they're doing. And one of their value propositions is that they're able to create really good training data based off of the human labelers that they have as part of their organization. And so any organization that wants to use AI, but to use AI, that means that you not only need to have the sophisticated algorithms and the
Mm.
machinery and the data infrastructure, you also need to have the data. And if the data is not clean, then that's a big detriment. You can have the
Yeah.
fanciest algorithm out there, but if the data has a lot of measurement error, if it's mislabeled, et cetera, then you just can't really do anything with it. And so
Yeah.
Scale AI is doing a great job. I think some of the bigger organizations want to try to use AI, but they're oftentimes it's the same thing that you were talking about earlier about HR departments. It's like the technology department, because this AI will sometimes get relegated to the technology department, and
Right. I
the
see.
technology
Yeah.
department might be good for hardware. They were created in a hardware era, but they don't necessarily think about software, and they might not have the
Mm.
talent, they might not have the incentives, because maybe their incentives are again tied to how much hardware is being released, just like a lot of times HR is tied to number of FTEs and total headcount. So there
Mm.
is this political economy dimension, there's a human capital dimension of just having the right people that can vet ideas. And so in dynamic, what one of the things that we're finding as well, just in the banking sector, is that there's also a lot of risk aversion from the regulator side, because regulators are always weary about seeing something new, and they don't, I mean, a lot of it's like it makes sense why it works the way that it is, but it's still not ideal, because there might be a model that's out there that is just performing really poorly. It's never been right. It's always like off by a large margin. And then a new model comes in that you can show has higher performance, but then people are like, well, it's new. And then it's the chicken and the egg. It's like you're talking about AI, you want to have
Yeah.
more innovation as a country, and then you're saying, oh, let's put the brakes for 5 years on whatever new invention. And so I think this is I guess a message just for everybody, is just like
Yeah.
think about what you're saying. If you care about innovation, then be willing to put your money and time and effort and talent where your mouth is, and
Mm.
just be willing to try new things, put the proper safeguards in place, have a backup solution. I mean, these aren't rocket science. If we can get to the moon, we should be able to figure out how to prototype AI in a small or mid-sized organization.
Exactly. I mean, do we think there's it's an education process as well, Christos? Do companies and leaderships, do they really understand AI, the power of it? How can it be deployed and the value that it can bring to a structure?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think when you think about why something that is good hasn't been adopted, there's a couple different explanations that can emerge. There might be some friction in the labor market or whatnot. There might be some
Yeah.
barrier. It might be like, I mean, it could just be a physical barrier. It could be whatever it might be. The second thing is information. And I think information is oftentimes a really that explains a lot of things in the world. But information is so multifaceted, because you might have the knowledge of something, but if you don't have the experiential, because you know when you meet somebody and you have a similar personal experience, there's a
Yeah.
level of trust that's embedded. And so I
Yeah.
think C-suite managers understand conceptually the value, but they might not have experiential knowledge with the technique or whatever it might be, with the specific proposal
Right.
on the table. And therefore, there's just not the same level of trust. And so the implication is, yes, education is something that will help facilitate greater adoption, but you have to be educating in the right way. And it really involves like breaking things down, making things relatable, giving analogies, showing people, and it puts it incumbent on the teacher, if I can use that role, or at least the person that's trying to persuade that maybe there's value. And they have a lot of responsibility just to how you explain things, and not to necessarily dive into details. You start with what is the goal of the decision maker, to create value for the consumer. And so then how do you do that? Well, we have to do X, Y, and Z. And if we can do X, Y, and Z a little bit better with software, and we can check it and benchmark it to humans and have a horse race between if just humans do it versus a little bit of software and humans. And so these are the things that I think an organization needs to think through.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're looking more broadly at the future of work, what does it hold for us, us as individuals, but also companies and enterprises as well, Christos? Where are we heading? Because it very much feels like we're on the start of something new. The kind of the genie's out of the bottle, and we're not able to put it back. We need to harness what's going on as opposed to try and stop it.
Yeah, exactly. I think anytime that there is some broad technological trend, it can always be used for good or for bad. We obviously see some actors using AI for malicious purposes, and in some countries it's used to kind of identify churchgoers or Uyghurs, and then try to use to find them and lock them up. And so there are very malicious uses of technology, but it's incumbent on those leaders, the right leaders, to be at the table and to influence it for the better. And so I'll break my comments down into two pieces. One is at the macro level. I think there's a lot of new opportunities emerging for countries, and I think of Greece, where I'm Greek American, and I think about Greece as a destination for tourism, but it can also be a destination for entrepreneurship. And so then you have to think through, what are the barriers to that? Well, there's a lot of policy barriers, and hopefully we can work through some of those. But you think about how remote work changes the landscape. Now you've got a bunch of Europeans that maybe don't want to be in the snow, or they want to take a little bit of a break when it's going dark at 3 or 4 p.m. And then spend time in Greece doing entrepreneurial.
Where do I sign up, Christos? Put me down for that.
Yeah. I'll give you I'll pass her name on. So if you can do creative work remotely, and there are spaces, economic incentives, tax incentives for doing that, regulatory structures, a safe policy environment, and so on, then why not? And so I think that this opens up a new set of tools for countries to attract human capital to them. And then on a micro level, I'll come back to where we kind of started the conversation on, where there's and this is a kind of more remote work flavor, but I'll kind of bring it back to AI as well, is that individuals need to think about their own time. When we were talking about human capital inventory for organizations, well, individuals need to think about an inventory for themselves. Where am I excelling? Where am I a little bit deficient? Where would I have these goals, I have these dreams for my family or for myself, how do I get there? And so then start breaking it down and being like, what new skills do I need to learn today? What new jobs or tasks or freelancer opportunities do I want to take on today? And then you build up human capital, you build up additional income, and then you get to your destination. And so I think that there's a ton of opportunities for both individuals, firms, and countries. And then when you bring kind of AI and the emerging Web3 economy into the mix, boy, there's just new business models that are also opening up. And the fact that like you can solve a complex AI model without having a supercomputer, you can run it on a cloud computing, you can do it with clusters. And so there's just so many more tools available, but the tools are only available if you know how to use them. And so that requires kind of give and take on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you raise a very important point there as well. I think these new technologies that can be used for good or used for bad, but in the same way that fire can cook your dinner or it can burn your house down, it's how it's used. And I think that what comes with the good comes with the bad, and I think we should focus on the positive side while addressing some of the negative points, but certainly to try and sort of squash this, to try and ignore the potential and the value, surely should be something that would be very negative for society, the economy, and government structures as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no, I mean, a country has to have these tools as part of their national strategy, their industrial strategy. And yeah, I mean, just kind of dismissing it is just going to kind of deepen the problem. And we don't say let's not use electricity or fire because, yeah, as you said, you could burn the house down. The question is, how do we wield fire appropriately so that we can
Yeah.
cook and do all sorts of things? So that definitely needs to be the conversation.
Absolutely. And well, we really look forward to the book, which is imminent, and also the fantastic work that you're doing, the papers with yourself, but also with colleagues. There's some really great material that you're producing to actually think about a lot of the emerging trends and filter out some of the negativity and also the reality of where we're going here, because we see some very strange narratives coming forward, a lot of reticence, a lot of negativity about what's happening, whereas what could be a force for good needs to be harnessed and used in that kind of way.
Exactly. Yeah. No, focus on kind of the good and the opportunity, and we'll all be better off.
Fantastic. Well, Christos, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the program. We will provide a link to some of your materials in the description to this episode, and look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Look forward to it.